Hello and welcome to Jive Talk. Today I've got another great guest on. I'm very excited to introduce Michailidis is the presenter and owner of the YouTube channel Ancient Greece Revisited, which is run by a team of modern Greeks who explore the wisdom of ancient Greece and then present it to the world and the wisdom therein in the form of well-crafted documentary films, which I really enjoy. And he also has a podcast on the side, which is associated with the channel, called On Tyranny. And I was a guest on that a year ago or so. And that covers some of the same themes of history and ancient Greece, but it also looks at modern problems relating to the tyranny of the modern world, which we all have to endure. So it's very useful kind of guests he gets on to discuss that sort of thing. So those are the sorts of themes I'm going to discuss with him tonight. It's my pleasure to welcome Michael to Jive Talk this evening.
Thank you very much, Tom. A pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. Well, first off, I'd like to pick up on some of the problems you've discussed recently on podcasts and on your channel relating to morality in ancient Greece. So many people look at Greek myths, the legends of Zeus and the heroes like Achilles or Heracles or whatever, and they struggle to find a clear moral code of the sort that they find in the Bible, and they might criticize, Greek wisdom for that reason. What is your approach to this problem?
Yeah, so it's actually at the center of what we're trying to do, because it's pretty much how I started this podcast by reading some very radical philosophers of ancient Greece, modern philosophers talking about ancient Greece, and one such person is called Kornilios Kastoriadis, who's a great philosopher. Past in the West. He's not well known, I think, in the world. So I consider it my duty to do what I can and promote him. And Castoriadis had a very, very interesting life and very interesting history. He was a man of the left, of the proper old school communist revolutionary left, okay, who had to flee Greece by the right, but persecuted by the Communist Party because he deviated from party line. Not a surprise there, but he had to literally flee for his life. There was a very famous boat journey that took place right after the Second World War in 1945. It was organized by the French Institute of Greece, and it took lots of intellectuals, young, promising minds, to Paris, where they would study. They were given scholarships, and Castoriadis practically jumped on board of that ship to save his life. And in Paris, he continued to be very radical, very left-wing, but being, frustrated by what the left had become, he began to dig deeper. And because his mind was of such caliber, he came to some very, very interesting conclusions about culture, which led him to investigate ancient Greece. It's no secret that the older we get, the more we need to go back to our roots. Castoriadis was not a very romantic man to say something like that, but I feel that is what happened in his later life, in his 50s and 60s. And he looked at ancient Greece from a new lens. I kind of took it literally, figuratively as a lens, turning it into a literal camera lens, and looked back visually now at ancient Greece. Okay, and you asked me about morality, and Castoriadis had some very interesting thoughts. First of all, before even going to his theories, we have to realize how rare this phenomenon of morality is, okay, in the metaphysical sense. It's very different for us to agree there are some common rules in our corporation. We might start a company tomorrow, let's say, and we will have some rules of behavior written in the contract and some more verbal, and we'll sign. And will agree these are the rules of engagement. Okay, that's one thing. All societies have that. I can't imagine a society existing without that kind of social contract. But that's not the morality that our culture has inherited. Our culture has inherited a very different morality, different in the ontologic sense. We have inherited a morality that is somehow ingrained in the universe, which is an idea that comes from Christianity, back to the Hebrew Bible. You won't find many works apart from that proclaim that the world is good, morally good. Made the world made the world and he saw it was good, or so the Bible says, which means it's good, it's morally good. Like, rescuing a child from a fire is good. Okay, that kind of thing, which is a very human thing, the Hebrews saw ingrained in the universe. Somehow they managed to see morality in the revolution of the forest, in how plants grow, how rain falls, in everything, good and bad. And of course, some will trace it a little bit further to the Zoroastrian faith. Zoroastrians were obviously the first to propose that there are these two primal forces of good and evil, each represented by a god, Ahriman, Ahura Mazda, respectively. And there is this primordial clash between the two, between good and evil, and some scholars have suggested that this has become the template for the Bible. Perhaps we didn't take it as much from the Zoroastrians, however. The Magi were there when Jesus was born, and there are many connections you can draw, of course, but predominantly we took this from Christianity, we took it from the Hebrew Bible. And because it has shaped our minds so much, we forget how rare of an idea is. It's not obvious when you look outside your window. You look clouds passing, seasons changing, day succeeding night, that this has some morality in it. That morality, it's not obvious that morality is anything but a human convention. Okay. Regardless of what the truth is there, it's obviously a huge question, which we're not going to solve in this podcast. My task is to find what is unique in Greece and in ancient Greek culture. What is unique, not what is the same. And perhaps we can talk a lot about Indo-European culture. And of course, the Greeks are part of this larger family. But I'm more interested in how they did it differently than how they did it the same. Had one of the comments. Yeah, please.
That's very interesting, and there's certainly this tension even in the Bible between the Greek, because like the Europe as it's in the Bible is Greece really, and the Greek. I mean, the Greek speakers in the Bible are prominent, and Greece is such a part of the world of the Bible. So it's interesting to see like that role within it. But I wonder whether I could push back a bit on what you're saying about to what extent are the Hebrews the first innovators of a conception of a good, of the world being innately good, because that is in Platonism, and I don't know also to what extent did they think of the world as good, because there is a kind of sense that God is good, the Hebrew God is good, and that worshiping is good, but they also seem to think of some aspects of the world being bad. And there are also like Jews before Christianity was influenced by Greece. Jews had been influenced by the Greeks and the Greek thought as well, like because the Levant was Greek speaking under the Eastern Roman rule. And Greek thought was all over the Mediterranean, it was all over the place. And Egyptian and Greeks were two big players in like ideologically in the Mediterranean world. So you've got things like Philo, he's a Platonist Jew, very influenced by Greek philosophy, and his perspectives influenced the way the Septuagint was translated by Greek Christians. So I think there's kind of an interplay there. But is it really? What I want to say is it really outside the Greek view to see the universe as good?
Yes, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
So, yeah, you mentioned, for example, a few names that are throughout history: Plato, Neoplatonist, the ancient Hebrews, the modern Hebrews. To go back to Castoriadis and finish and link that tangent, so as to not finish something. Castoriadis had this very unique idea that at the root of each culture, you are an anthropologist and you try to analyze cultures. I mean, you try to analyze cultures, literally the European cultures, and you trace them back perhaps to the Indo-European cultures and to other cultures, and you try to understand, why things are the way they are, our institutions. You can take any random institution like marriage, for instance, and go and say, okay, Western style of marriage is based on the idea of romantic love, not the idea of arranged marriages. The idea of, okay, you reach that far, where they get, well, you have a combination of eros, which is ancient Greek, and agape, which is Christian, and they mixed it and they turned it into a more. So now you have a tree. So you dig. Castoriadis, unlike the modern reductionists, believe that you can dig as far as you want. Ultimately, you end, for each culture, the Greek culture, the Jewish culture, even cultures like communism was a culture for him, capitalism was a culture, modernity was a culture, Indo-Europeans were definitely a culture. You can dig and dig and dig. Ultimately, what you find is a core of images. That's what Castoriadis said, images, which are not pictorial representations. They're not like photos. They're images like dream images are, like compressed concepts. Like, sometimes you say, oh, I saw my father, but he wasn't exactly my father. He was also my teacher from school. And I also understood that he was getting married and he was having a second child and that he was going to die all at once. It happens in dreams. When we say, I saw something, it's not like you see just that one thing. You understand lots of layers of what you see. And then when you wake up, you try to break it down and analyze it. And you say, it was my father, but also my teacher, and he was getting married and he was dying. But this is not really what happened. You saw all of these things in one, and you apprehended it as one. Castoriadis believed that when you reach to the core of each culture, you get a set of images different for each culture. And from that core, cultures grow like flowers rather than evolve like we are taught. Cultures are almost born like in a big bang. They just happen, because when you reach that level of images, you can't reduce it further, and everything implies, at that root, everything implies everything else. Okay, so for someone like Castoriadis, Greek culture, like all cultures, it was born. It did not evolve, and it was born roughly in the 10th and 9th century BC, which is interesting because it's the centuries we know the least of what happened. Sometimes they're called the antiquity. Relating to your work, what we do know is that there was a branch of the Indo-European migration. Here in Greece, we call them Dorians. It comes from Dori, which means spear. They were the spear bearers because they brought, like many Indo-Europeans, later migration waves, iron, so spears of iron rather than bronze. And they somehow found pre-existing people living here. They found the Minoans of Crete and a whole complex of other cultures, more minor perhaps, that were very different in current character. Something happened, some genomic, chemical, cultural reaction happened. It took 2 whole centuries that were very dark because no one wrote about them, because most probably no one knew how to write. Writing, which the Minoans knew, was forgotten during these centuries. But out of that, you have a complete culture. Okay, it's very important for me, at least, to know that Greek mythology did not evolve in stages. You don't have a culture that worships 3 gods and then 4 and then adding on to 12. You have the 12 gods all together. In ancient Egypt, the same thing. You have a whole mythology. And you see it again and again. It's modern historians, because they are so influenced, break things, favor an evolutionary narrative where cultures kind of build up slowly. But if you actually look at history, you won't find that. You won't find that. You will find cultures being born all at once, the 12 gods all at once, Egyptian mythology. And in that all at once, Castoriadis believed there was a seed to go back to the morality. Okay. In 8th century, Greece was already born, was in its infant stage. Okay, after 2 centuries of fighting, migrating, mixing, intermixing, Greece was finally born. We won't know exactly the process that led. Castoriadis was not interested in that, because he believed that you can't know in a way. Things they just happen. Around the same time, you have the crystallization of the Hebrew culture. Okay, and the Bible was written obviously based on pre-existing narratives. Narratives are not as important. The form they took was the important thing. Castoriadis believed that Greek dictionary, okay, the root, the seed out of which this flower grew, was captured in word once by a man called Anaximandros. Okay, Anaximandros was, some would say, the second philosopher in history. Thalis, his teacher, was the first. Anaximandros, his student, was the second. And Anaximandros said something very, there's one fragment this survives from Anaximandros, okay? And according to this man, Castoriadis, whom I follow his work, it captures the Greek imaginary, that seed, it's in its purest. And it's very condensed, and philosophers have gone crazy. Heidegger loved it, wrote books about it. Castoriadis had his own opinions. But in short, it sounds like this in translation. Anaximandros is talking about beings, okay? Things that are is being, to on in Greek, that it's something that is. I'm a being, you're a being. The set perhaps is a being, you know, processes are being, they are. So Anaximandros talks about beings, and he says this, he says, from where they come, there they must return, because the beings inflict upon each other just punishment for the injustice they have committed against the order of time. Okay, so very condensed. You can take it many ways, but Castoriadis believed that the translation, in, you know, binding it to the context of ancient Greece, really was this: that being, to be, is a form of transgression against non-being. Okay, life, existence, is an act of robbery. Almost like, it's almost like non-existence is the default stage, the state of tranquility. It's how things should be, if that could make any sense on that level of reality. Non-existence. Being, whatever is, steals itself, steals its existence from non-existence. It's an act of robbery. Perhaps that's not uniquely Greek in the absolute sense. You can find this in a lot of mythologies, where, at least for human life to happen, some kind of transgression would happen. Talking about the Hebrews of the Bible, obviously you have Adam and Eve. For us to live the life that we are living, some insult had to happen, some robbery, stealing. Always strikes me as strange and beautiful and interesting when I think that the apple that Adam and Eve ate, the knowledge, you know, rather than the apple of sin, the apple of evil, it was the apple of knowledge. We ended up here. And back to Native Americans, you have, the figure of Coyote, who ruins things when the cosmos is created. He does something silly and stupid and bites a piece out of the cosmos and digests it and comes out the other way. And some kind of entropy, some kind of noise is introduced in that perfect system for us to exist. The idea is there. What is unique in Greece is the implications of that idea. Again, following the works of Castoriadis. And the implication is this, that your existence now is a form of transgression. You're not a blessed being made in the image of any god, according to the Greeks. But that's okay, because even the gods are, in some sense, on the same plane. They also stole their existence. And they will suffer at some point. There is this great tragedy by Achilles, Prometheus bound, which, because Prometheus was obviously the Titan who stole fire from Zeus and gave it to men for us to exist. You can say fire was technology or our ingenuity for technology, but it was that special something that we lack physically. We have no claws, no feathers, no wings, but we have that special something to make up for it. And for the Greeks, they made up this myth, Prometheus stole fire from the gods. So you have this act of transgression, which is almost like that of the Bible. Some knowledge was stolen from the gods for us to exist as humans. So Zeus punishes Prometheus. He ties him on a rock. You have this horrible image of an eagle eating his liver every day, which regrows because he's immortal, so he has to suffer it again and again and again. And Aeschylus, the great playwright, had a tragedy where he has Prometheus talking with Zeus. That's most of it. And Prometheus essentially says, look, you're next. Zeus, Father, you are immortal, but you're not eternal. The God of the Bible was eternal. Zeus was not eternal. And Prometheus can dare to talk about eternal. We're all bound by this force we call mira, which translates to fate, but it makes more sense in the context of what I just said. It's this natural force of taking beings back into non-existence. And it's almost like for the Greeks relished in this image. If you imagine beings stealing their existence from non-existence, you have to be very abstract. You have to take things with a pinch of salt. But if you imagine that ripping a little piece of non-existence and you make the shape that is Tom Rouser, when that thing comes back to get you, it will have the same shape as you. Okay, so if you are Hercules, you steal that form of strength and might, you will die by this might, by this strength. And Hercules in mythology died almost by his own hand. He was given a scarf filled with poison, and when he wore it, it kind of burned his skin, and he kind of tried to take it out. And because he was so strong, he pulled the skin out of his hand. He didn't do anything wrong morally. Okay, if he were a character in the Bible, he would have been punished for some moral transgression, insulting God, not performing the right sacrifice, disobeying God. Most likely, God would have given him a command, kill your own son, and he would have said no, and he would have been punished. The Greeks knew not that. The core of the universe for the Greeks, you did not have a moral world. The world did not have morality ingrained in it. The world had this law, almost, which is kind of what I described. To finish this off, please
But this,
you know.
may I interject? I just saying, I understand you're describing the Greeks in general, but in just going back to the original question I asked, that this is this and excludes Plato from that definition of Greek, because Plato's exceptional in that. Because I mean, okay. Because
so in that view,
do see the world as good and having a morality in it, so they're going to be.
So in that view, you have cultures that are born almost like in its explosions from the birth of the radical imaginary. They fall off. According to this view, cultures do not progress. They start, boom, they go out, and then they kind of fall off and decay. By the closer you are back, the more you go back, the closer you are to this original Greek imaginary. You find it in Homer.
So Homer is the
in the Odyssey. Yeah, please.
So Homer is the better example of the Greek view you're talking about, in which there is no inherent morality, but Plato's an exception from a later stage.
Plato comes at the fore. Yeah, Plato writes, don't forget, after Greece had begun to decline. Okay. He puts his ideas in the mouth of Socrates, but we don't know that. We don't know how much of that is Socrates and how much of that is Plato. If you read Socrates from the writings of Xenophon, it's a very different Socrates. If you read Socrates from the writings of Aristophanes, who made fun of Socrates, it's a very different Socrates. The Socrates that we know is Plato's Socrates. We can't be sure. We can be sure about Plato's own ideas, but Plato wrote after Greece began to decline, and Athenians were defeated by the Spartans at the end of the Peloponnesian War. That was the beginning of the end of ancient Greece. Something there. Again, we don't know what. But, Pericles was the great Athenian leader who reigned over Athens during its peak. He was democratically elected, but he was democratically elected so many times that he might as well be a king, that kind of thing. And he was there when Athens got involved in war. He was partly to blame. And when the first dead came back from war, he wrote this famous funeral oration that was for the first dead. And he talks about Athens. He talks about the character of Athens, the city of Athens, which is a little strange because his audience was all Athenians. It's almost like, I don't know, Boris Johnson might be a bad example, but it's almost like, Winston Churchill kind of going in length of what exactly it means to be English. It's not inconceivable. It's something he might do, but you have to wonder why now, against an English audience, against the Athenians of the century, why so much about what being an Athenian means. And one way to read it is that it's almost like a tragedy play. It's almost like a tragedy play. And if it is a tragedy play, the main character is Athens itself. Following this idea of, beings being punished just for their existence, Pericles presents an Athens that is almost punished for being great. He presents Athens that did no wrong in a way, which is not necessarily historically accurate, but an Athens that was punished, it's going to go down. It's almost like he knew there's a melancholy in this writing, although this was just the first year of the war. It's almost like he knew it was going down, and he gave a very Greek explanation. It's just going down because it's so damn great. It has to go.
This ties in with a conception of tragic poetic justice that you've described.
Absolutely.
I heard on a recent podcast you're describing this. using a modern example of the Formula One driver Schumacher, and that he was crippled, having gone so fast. And you said that he had too much speed, and that, so this was poetic justice acting upon him, a kind of transient justice.
Yeah, that's the thing, because I understand, like, you know, you talk about morality. I know that Jordan Peterson is very, very famous on YouTube. And I know that he's struggling with morality. You can see it in his last videos. And he almost devoted his life in taking myths from around the world and trying to find a moral. And sometimes he succeeds, sometimes not. The problem is that if you really want to understand the Greek mind, rather than the mind of a Christian like Peterson looking upon the Greeks, to look at the example of Michael Schumacher that you mentioned, Formula One driver, the greatest, some say, who almost had this perfect life. You know, he was respectful, very aggressive, very fast, respectful, hardworking, managed to retire at the top of his career, which is something that sports people often fail to do. And then he was done. He was done, like Hercules. He was done. He was raised life to his family. Then what happens? Goes on a trip, slips on a stone, breaks his head, remains paralyzed for life. If you can look at that and say this is there, then you will have approached the minds of the Greeks. It's obviously not moral justice. It's not the justice of the court system. Again, if someone were to do this to him, he should have gone to jail for life. No question there. But no one did that to him. Even he didn't do that to him. It's almost like the gods did that to him. You know, what kind of gods could have done this to him? Only the Greek gods. Because beings have to be punished for their injustice against the order of time. Schumacher stole too much speed from time. He was too fast. And now he has to be the slowest, immobilized if need be.
So the reason I think that's really a very concise way of illustrating the point, and it's a good example to use of this to demonstrate what this kind of worldview is like. But I can understand why people would find it difficult to deal with, because it doesn't have, especially if you come from a sentimental culture like that, there's no consolation in there. So there's no clear morality. And perhaps that's because there was never any, as you know, the Greeks didn't, and like I think actually some of the early other Indo-European religions have similarly a similar coldness to them, but in the early stuff. But do you find consolation in such a worldview?
I'll be perfectly honest with you, and you know, in my most honest of moments, I have to say I do hold beliefs about the afterlife. You know, I know I'll see my parents.
You do hold beliefs about the afterlife. Sorry, you're breaking up a bit, so I couldn't hear.
Yeah, I do hold beliefs about the afterlife. You know, going back to what you said before, you said Plato, the Neoplatonists, you know, they didn't exactly have this view that I ascribed to the ancient Greeks, and that's right. But again, they came later. What's very important to understand about ancient Greek religion is that there were two religious tendencies in ancient Greece. Okay, one was the pure, let's say, purer, perhaps Indo-European, the Olympian faith, the 12 gods, who were cruel, and in Homer you find no consolation. Remember, there's this really important 12th Rhapsody, sometimes called Nekia, which is a Greek word for something like necromancy, perhaps. And Odysseus visits the world of the dead. He doesn't exactly go down. It's more like at the far edges of the world. at the land of the Cimmerians, are funnily enough the Conan people. There, the land of the living touches the land of the dead, and he performs the correct rituals, mixes blood, honey, and milk, and the dead come crawling almost like vampires, thirsty for blood. And there he sees his mother, who he did not know had died. And she's like this mindless, almost creature with no will, nous, or thimos, or will or mind. The poet says, and they can only remember their past lives if they drink blood, and they understand for a moment who they were. And there Odysseus meets Achilles, who is the lead character of the previous epic, the Iliad. And Achilles is always described as theomorphos, godlike, godlike, beautiful, cruel, the epitome of the Greek, called great warrior, courage, self-sacrifice. And he has to give him blood to remember who Achilles was. And Odysseus says something to the effect that, you Achilles of all people, you must be hailed as a king. And Achilles turns to Odysseus and says, better to be a servant of a poor man in the land of the living than a king in the world of the dead. That comes in the context of a very aristocratic, recently Greekified Indo-European culture. So you understand the gravity of these terms when you have your lead hero speak like that. How, you look for consolation. You won't any in that underworld. You won't find any. And that was clearly the one religious tendency, the Homeric Olympian religious tendency that was there, present more in the Iliad than anywhere else. Then you had the second one, which was also present, which was the Orphic, Dionysiac, related to the Eleusinian mysteries, the ever-dying, ever-living God, the reincarnating God, born out of a immortal, a half-god sometimes. I know that there's this film, you might call it, called Zeitgeist, that introduced millions of people in this concept of the ever-dying, ever-rising God, made a connection there between Dionysus, Horus, and Jesus Christ, talking about this, perennial faith in reincarnation. And it is perennial, it was there, and many legitimate connections can be drawn between Dionysus and Jesus. But it was only one such tendency. And there was another, which was the first that I described. What happened historically is that when Greece was born, like I described, and all at once, and was written about in Homer's epics, the first tendency, the Homeric Olympian, was clearly the dominant. And then as Greece began to decline, the second one, the Orphic, Dionysiac, reincarnating belief in the afterlife, became dominant. Eight, you mentioned, historically is right on that switch. Even within his writings, you can see it. The early Platonic dialogues, you have a Socrates, is clearer, not very metaphysically thinking. He's, the man who knows nothing, not very religious. By the end of his life, he's lying in prison to be executed by the Athenian state, and he has his last dialogue with his students, and there essentially he speaks an Orphic doctrine, whereby the soul, when it came into this world, had to drink from a well, which is lithy, which means forgetfulness. And when the soul dies, it will come back and it will find this same well, and next to it, it's going to be another well, mnemosini, which means remembrance. It will drink from that, and it will remember, the soul will remember who she truly is, which is a part of the gods. And that's verbatim an Orphic doctrine. And you find it in Plato, in the later Plato. And from there, from that moment, you only you have Orphism all the way.
But
Leading
may I say something that I think my audience would be interested in? I've pointed out before, but there's a recent essay which I think is very good about the Orphic mystery cult and exactly the two wells you've described, and a very good argument that this is of Indo-European origin, because there are other Indo-European beliefs in the afterlife where you go down and then there's a body of water, and most people drink from that water and then they remain in the underworld. But if you go beyond that body of water and past a tree, then there's another body of water, and from that one you can escape that fate as a shade and become something else. So it seems like the Orphic mystery cult contained something that was not unique to the Greek world, at least, but it's hard to tell what. But you see elements of that in the Germanic tradition as well, with the roots of the tree in the underworld going into these wells of memory, and you drink from the well of memory, and it's in the Germanic tradition as well. So,
it's not clear cut. It's not clear cut. You can find moments of purity which you can isolate. For example, the Iliad is very pure in many sense. There's no belief in the afterlife. No one is hoping to go to any heaven or any hell. The gods are not moral agents at all. They have compassion. Sometimes they favor human and they feel sadness, but that's like feeling sad for a bird that falls dead from a tree. You'll forget it the next moment, and you'll have a dinner with a chicken there. And the gods are a little bit like that. You have, and then on the other spectrum, you have something like the Hermetic tradition, where it's the other extreme, where this world is a prison. The material plane is a prison of spirit, and the only thing a reasonable person can do is try and escape. And that world, which was the late Hellenistic world, was very open to Christianity as an idea. So
because there were all mystery cults kicking about the Roman Empire at that time. So I guess.
Yeah. But you can, you don't know where the transition is. For me, it makes sense to point around the end of the Peloponnesian War. Spiritually, I link it to the First World War as well, to the First and Second World War in history. Something broke there in the European spirit, and something broke in the Athenian spirit, and the Greeks, and the ancient Greek spirit, because the Spartans were victorious, but they didn't exactly behave victorious. They didn't thrive for many years after that. It's interesting, just like Europe, victorious from the Second World War. It didn't act like a victor. It fell into some kind of cultural melancholy, which leads to a lot of the ills that we see today. So something broke there, and I don't know why. But it's interesting how it was that the Orphic began to emerge more dominantly.
A change in culture following a change in spirit. But I wanted to also ask you about, I've heard you describe a different dichotomy from good and evil within the Greek worldview, which balances a kind of will to power, which pushes the limits of one's fate, with a kind of hubris. So I think you say, mirror as fate, or the portion of life, which is roughly equivalent to what Anglo-Saxons called weird. And then the hubris of stepping beyond that, taking more than your share, and that can be disrespectful to the gods in the way it was for Prometheus. So you've described. Can you talk about that tension, this opposing tension in the examples of the Greek heroes, and also in terms of understanding power today, and how people are If people are trying to, push the boundaries of what man is, in the transhumanist ideology, for example.
Yeah, so you said that right. There's these two words, mira and ivris, which relates to that radical Greek imaginary about how beings come and go from existence, punished almost by their existence. And mira, yes, it usually translates as fate, but it's not like kishmet, where it's like a path that's been opened to you. It's the word itself, like you said, means a share, like a share of a pie, and you get your little share to eat, and everyone gets, and that's the life that you're assigned. And we know that the Greeks imagined three divine figures, three women, mires, one would generate the piece of string it was imagined. The other would measure it and cut it and just measure it and assign it to each living being. And the third, the most terrible, would cut it and define the limits, which is your death. And in this concept, the simplest way of saying it is that the heroes for ancient Greeks were those who exceed this limit, for whom the string is not enough, and therefore they are punished through ivris, was the act of stepping outside of your limits and being punished. But following what I tried to explain in the beginning, that the Greeks had a very different imaginary than we do. We should not imagine a line as a limit, like you tell a child, don't go beyond this fence, as if anything before the fence is okay, but as soon as you cross it, you've transgressed. It wasn't like that. We have to keep in mind this idea that being is a transgression by itself. We right now are in we are gods, Tom, as we're speaking. It's almost like there is something in this universe that does not like us very much. Almost. And it's not a moral agent. It's not Satan. It's a force, that just punishes beings for existing. So it's not a limit that a hero passes and then gets cut down. We exceeded our limits just by existing. The Greeks enjoyed the heroes who kind of knew that and kept on growing and said, so what? I'm even going to grow bigger, knowing that my punishment is going to be bigger. It's like we're pulling a spring, and we know that when we let it go, it's going to go the opposite way with the same force, because we have to pull it to exist. The hero just pulls it, says that it's almost like sticking your finger up to non-existent, saying, I don't care. This defiance that could not have made sense for the Hebrews who wrote the Bible. It made sense to the Greeks because it was standing up to this force that just counters being itself. Okay, so it's pretty much what I tried to describe in that video I did about a man called Onassis, who was a billionaire. He was a tycoon. He was one of the richest men alive back in the 60s and 70s, and he had a story that the Greeks would love, because Onassis was a person that identified with his riches in a way that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't. Okay, Onassis kind of almost, you could see that he was almost playing a character of that rich, man who can just buy everything at the flick of his fingers. And he had children, and he had a son who he deemed heir to his throne, and he loved him very much. And this son tragically died on a plane crash at the age of 20, 24. And there is this scene, historical scene, by the way, where Onassis speaks on the phone with a doctor, and the doctor says, look, even if your son dies, he's going to be this, that, and the other. Should we pull the plug for the machines that were supported? And Onassis says, yes, pull the plug. And he's all the money in the world cannot save me from my fate. And that the Greeks would love it. Today there's so much antipathy to this type of person, to this rich magnate, that a lot of people today are saying, there, you got it. You got what you deserved, you and your riches. The Greeks would have loved it. The Greeks would have written tragedies about this man. Was something almost he confirms their understanding of reality. That we are here, me, you talking, listening, we're performing some kind of transgression against non-existence, and we're each going to be punished. If you live a small life, a common life, the only punishment is going to be the common punishment of death. You're going to grow old, wither, and die. But if you live a great life, it's going to be some poetic justice for the Greeks to remind us about this law.
And there's also a role involved in fame, isn't there? Like in the Greek view in general, like fame itself, having earned fame in life, is a way of sort of beating death, or in a kind of
it's the only thing you can do, because it's the only thing that remains. You've talked a lot about Indo-European culture, and a lot of people today think of Indo-European culture as a warrior culture predominantly, which it was, but we forget that it was also a poetic culture. The figure of the poet is a very Indo-European figure, as distinct from the priest, as distinct from from various ritual things. The poet, the poet was honored, was for all we know was the highest paid profession in many Indo-European cultures, because he had this ability, for a culture that did not believe in immortality the way we wish it today. He had that magic of giving you something like it, something that you can hope for, by creating works that will outlive you.
Well, I wanted to just push back to the another part of the question before last, where I asked about the emerging global technocracy. Do you see that as a form of hubris, where they're going against the limitations of man and of man with sheer willpower, but is this kind of is an ideology of pure hubris impious and sort of hateful to the gods, because there's like the gods like heroes who are like push against their fate and go, but they don't like Prometheus. I mean, Prometheus ends up with a horrible ending, and is such a civilization and destined to an equally unpleasant end, in your opinion?
Yeah, so it's very clear to me that our culture in ancient Greek would be the most hubristic culture that has ever existed. I mean, if the Greeks saw hubris, there's this episode when the Persian king tried to conquer Greece, and he tried to pass from the Bosphorus at the north from Asia to Greece and come from the north with his armies. And on that day, the Bosporus was very stormy, and it damaged his fleet, and he was angered, and he ordered his men to throw chains and chain the Bosporus itself. The king can order the sea to get calm, and the Greeks, again, they loved it as an image because it was such an act of hubris. And of course, he would be punished at sea at the Battle of Salamis, and the whole story ties together. That is nothing in comparison with what we have today. Today we have a culture where we literally believe we're going to become gods, that we have solved all problems, that we can solve all problems. We talk about immortality. People are talking, about uploading their consciousness into a computer and living forever. Transhumanism, transhumanism is hubris. It's almost like the dictionary definition. And so we do live in the most hubristic cultures. For the ancient Greeks, we're going to be punished like no other culture. Like we're going down. I don't know when or how or if it's going to happen, but it's clear to me the Greeks, would be looking at us with wonder, like in cartoons. You have this character who's standing, and there's a huge stone behind him, balancing at a little pole, and any blow of wind can tip it, and the character is just looking casually. And you're a child, you're looking at this cartoon, you're so excited because a bird is going to sit and it's going to go boom and just crush him. That's our culture, that character, and this stone is the force of hubris. Me, yeah.
I think it's really hard to say how it would be perceived by the Greeks when we've already established at the beginning of this podcast that there's a difference between late and early Greece. Yeah. I think that certainly, like, the Platonic view must be against this kind of transhumanism because it sees already as the world as good and the gods as good and there's not a need to perfect mankind. It's like the perfection. The goal of Greek philosophy is to unite with the divine in the Platonic view, anyway. So there's no need to unite with a singularity, a technological constructed consciousness or something, and that's all waste of time. But I wonder, like, some of the things, like, perfection of the biology of humans, like transhumanism. You said in a recent podcast, you had an interview where the origins of transhumanism were connected to eugenics, and I mean, some of the Spartan practices of infanticide, for example, are essentially a form of early eugenics. So maybe do you think that those are, to what extent do you think like some transhumanist ideals can be, so it's the same question really, but could the Spartans, admire transhumanists, or would they be like more like the Platonists, do you think, and condemn this?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, and like you said, we can't really grasp the mind of ancient Greeks. I think we can only approach it, which is why I prefer like crude examples, like the one I gave about Michael Schumacher, that people are going to say, "What?" It's almost like pushing someone a little bit further. Modernity itself is very peculiar, and I've been trying to understand it for a long time. What is it? Like I talked about this switch between the Homeric and the Orphic religion that happened around the time of Plato. There was this tremendous switch that happened just after the Renaissance and before the Enlightenment, which opened the way for the modern world, and you find it in many writings. This denial, this insistence on the material plane, would estrange, I think, any Spartan and any Greek just before even reached the point of eugenics. The example that you quoted, just for the listeners, it comes from, it's very interesting because it comes from the United Nations, the first declaration of the United Nations. Okay, so it's a public document, and you can read it. And the United Nations, in my generation, I bet in Europe, people listening, the United Nations had this ring of goodness about it. It was an organization. If you don't dig any deeper, it's an organization that's trying to unite the world, make it a more peaceful place. And what can be wrong with that, right? So it's very interesting how, you just have to read the original declaration, which is written, ironically, by Julian Huxley, who is the brother of Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley wrote Brave New World, which is becoming very, very popular today as of the recent pandemic. for obvious reasons, a lot of people feel like they've been living in a dystopia. Brave New World 1984 by Orwell had become very popular. People are arguing, is our world more like 84 or Brave New World? Perhaps a bit of both. But it's very interesting to me that the brother of Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, was very involved in the United Nations. I think it served as its first, I don't remember, chairman. But he wrote that declaration. In there, you know, he essentially says that communism was the right doctrine in a way, but, you know, the flesh was too weak to sort of think that. I don't remember exactly how he phrased, but there needs to be a genetic component the second time, like we try this communism thing. You know,
if humans aren't right for communism, then it's not communism that needs to change.
Exactly.
It's humans. they can't admit a default. Like, oh, that failed. We need to change the human or organism so that it can fit this ideology created by probably dysfunctional human organisms in the first place. But
so it's not as much the idea of changing our nature. We have to remember that we are ultimately this creature that changes its nature. You know, the foods we ate, we had to adapt. You know, the way we look was part of some kind of you know, kind of forced evolution. We decided this way. You know, the animals that surround us, the cats and the dogs, they are products of genetic engineering, even if it was very primitive. Yeah, though
selective breeding was Indo-Europeans doing that to bring us horses and
exactly
cows.
Horses. I was ready to say, you know, the first horses ever ridden looked more like ponies, from what I understand today. And of course you have the legendary horses of Arthurian romance that, you know, you can in England, they're giants and all this, and we consider them very noble creatures, you know, the horses. Perhaps if we were to look at the first horses back in the Eurasian plains, we think they look more like donkeys. So we've been engaged in genetic engineering, and we will be. It's part because we are this half natural, half creating our own nature. It's the purpose that's interesting. Talk about the Spartans had a purpose, which was ultimately, it was a very strange purpose for us today, the Spartan purpose, and it was freedom. Okay, it's very strange for us to think that the Spartans consider themselves the most free of all Greeks, although their life was regulated pretty much 24/7. You know, the Spartans they had free time, and they had a lot of time to spend with other men of their military group, and they engaged in song, in drinking, you know, but that was all in a very, very regulated culture. I mean, there's this legend, but they consider themselves the most, you know, and because it's that important but very subtle difference between freedom and liberty, and there's many definitions for each word, and sometimes even in the great writings of the liberals themselves, they get intermixed. But ultimately, freedom is more like having no external compulsion, external limitations. I have freedom because I can open the door and go out and have a walk without anyone asking me where I'm going, which is a freedom we lost for more than a year during the pandemic. That freedom.
So it's like that the difference is there in the intent. So it's not just that they want to
in the intent, you know,
doing it for a noble cause, like the liberty of the people. It's completely different from doing it for the opposite reason, which is altering human beings to be more obedient subjects. Is completely different to making them better warriors, so that they can never be subjugated. It's the complete opposite, in fact.
It's the complete opposite. And
please go on.
And you'll notice something very strange in the way people talk about transhumanism and talk about these evolutions in computer technology, and they talk about them as if they are inevitable. there's this famous writer that I dislike, Yuval Harari. It's become very. He wrote
Yes,
Sapiens.
yes.
Yeah.
He's very popular with the UN. When I worked at WHO and I was in the UN headquarters, they have his books up everywhere, and everyone's reading. Everyone who works for WHO and UN reads him, and he says he condenses. He does similar work to what I do. He talks about the human history in a narrative context, but the narrative is very much aligned to the UN's narratives.
Yeah, and it's very interesting how people like him, they see this evolution as inevitable. These technologies are going to come. We are going to merge with machines, whether we like it or not. So it's just about thinking about the best ways. That makes no sense. That's insulting to the thousands of scientists who dedicate their lives into, materializing these technologies. No, it's almost like saying that Usain Bolt had no choice but run faster than everyone else. He had a choice of being a lazy bum. He chose not to, and he worked very hard. You can't say it was inevitable for him to succeed. You can't say it's inevitable for these technologies to be materialized. No, they're being pushed daily with lots and lots.
I think there's another example I would like to bring up and get your opinion on before, because we've run out of time, unfortunately. But the example of Icarus is sort of an example of technology, isn't it, that goes too far. So it's one thing. No human was punished for the invention of the sword or the spear, these kind of things. But when man tried to fly up to the sun, then he met his just desserts. Do you think that's an applicable? Do you think we could apply that same distinction between the types of technology that were proposed by transhumanists and the new technocratic world order?
Yeah, absolutely. And what's astonishing is that it's it's stated in the open. It's almost like, mankind doesn't even try to trick the gods anymore, like through Prometheus. It's very openly stating we are going to become immortal. We don't see no problem. It's almost, there's this incredible naivety that they just declare the very things that for the Greeks would be the ultimate transgressions to the gods, and they just say them without blinking an eye. They just say, Icarus, he was punished because he used wax. We're going to use silicon, and we're going to make wings, and we're going to reach the sun. That's it. It was a fault of engineering, not a fault of misunderstanding the nature of being of the universe.
Well, on that note, I think we should. We're going to have to end this podcast, and it's a very fascinating discussion. I'm afraid an hour goes by so quickly.
It does.
Yeah, we'll. I must and ask everyone. I must encourage you all to go and subscribe to Ancient Greece Revisited and check out some of the older videos on it, because there's some really great content on there that deserves more views. Is there anything else you'd like to make the viewers aware of, Michael?
No, would keep on, doing videos, and like I told you, Tom, earlier in our private conversation, it's very hard to know what you're doing wrong when you receive very, very generous comments from listeners, my own. So, I like to hear criticism. Don't necessarily be I love to hear I love to hear how great the videos are, but I love to hear criticism as well. Your criticism is very, very welcome there. If it's, respectful and constructive, it's very welcome.
Well, that's very humble for a content creator. Someone else would be a transcript of this because there was an audio issue. I'm sorry to everyone who, if there was some streaming difficulties, but I'll try and clean it up and re-upload it as a podcast. Okay, everybody. Thanks very much for watching, and keep surviving the jive.